All right. It's been a tough news week, but I'm really glad to have an expert panel to help us make sense of it here today on Bad Faith Pod. I'm joined today by returning guest, Shahid Buttar, who, of course, you know, is a constitutional lawyer, direct action organizer, and former congressional candidate. Welcome, Shahid.
Thank you so much for having me, Rhea. It's great to be with you.
We're also joined by Graeme Smith, author of The Dogs Are Eating Them Now, Our War in Afghanistan, co-writer and presenter of Ghost of Afghanistan, a documentary film about the war that airs this year in English, French, and German. Welcome, Graeme.
Thanks for having me.
And finally, Stephen Semler, co-founder of Security Policy Reform Institute, which is a grassroots think tank. Welcome, Stephen.
Thanks for having me.
There's been a lot of back and forth on this issue, including some gaps on the left, some frisson on the left about how to interpret this withdrawal of troops from Afghanistan, something that the left on the whole has been really pushing for and excited about for a long time. However, kind of faced with the optics, the footage of the humanitarian crisis that has ensued, it's caused some people to take what they would call a more nuanced stance and say, well, maybe we should have withdrawn in a different way. And that has created a kind of a conversation that I think sometimes is a little devoid of facts about what is actually possible. Is there a better way to do this? And how do we get into the situation today? And is there a likelihood that this could have been improved in any way, shape, or form? So I want to start with you, Graeme. I know that you're dealing with a very proximate relationship to this, in contact with people that you know are still on the ground or who are experiencing the consequences of this withdrawal firsthand. How would you recommend the left look at this issue and understand what's going on?
One of the remarkable things about the war in Afghanistan is it sort of wore out its welcome both on the left and the right in the American political world. One of the few things that gets traction with both Democrats and Republicans is the idea that forever wars need to end. And it's been interesting to see polling suggesting that even now, even witnessing the chaos in Kabul and people clinging to the fuselage of evacuation flights until they fall to their death, even despite that, polls still suggest people think Biden made the right decision. So I think there was an exhaustion with the war. The war, just objectively, like outside of the world of politics, objectively, the war was the deadliest war on the planet Earth. You know, it was killing tens of thousands of people a year. It was displacing hundreds of thousands of people a year from their homes. It was a disaster. The scale of the body count can't be underestimated. This was deadlier than all of the Middle Eastern wars combined. Syria, Yemen, Iraq, all put together. Bloodier in Afghanistan. So the fact that it has come to a grim conclusion with a complete Taliban takeover, with the exception of a tiny handful of northern provinces that are, or northern districts rather, that are resisting, it is not what America would have wanted, but it could end the deadliest war on the planet.
So when you say it's not what America would have wanted, you're talking about the idea of actually having something that looks like victory. What would that have meant? Was there ever a world in which that kind of a nation-building project had any tangible relationship to reality?
You know, when you're a superpower, reality doesn't always impinge on your decision-making. I spent most of my professional career sort of downrange of American firepower, seeing the consequences and, working in Afghanistan in various capacities. I was always sometimes amused, sometimes dismayed that uprange, as it were, inside the bubble of DC policymaking, that, these decisions could be taken often with very little regard to the facts on the ground. And, that was true as America invaded, and it was true as America withdrew. America was caught completely off guard by how things would unfold. I don't think they fully understood how powerful the Taliban were militarily. They certainly didn't understand how popular the Taliban were amongst rural communities. And so we went in deluding ourselves and we went out deluding ourselves, unfortunately.
Shahid, can you perhaps give us a little bit of historical perspective of how we got to this place and the timing of this withdrawal?
Sure. I might go back even before we got to this place and just note that every empire ever to invade Afghanistan has not only lost its attempt to occupy the country ultimately, but it shattered its own empire on the anvil of that country. That happened to the British. It happened to the Soviet Union, and it might be happening as we speak to the United States. In the 80s, the CIA channeled billions of dollars, which was worth a lot more at the time, to fund the precursors to Al-Qaeda, known at the time as the Mujahideen. They were the precursors to the Taliban. And in I can't even say the latest because there have been other examples since then, but at the time, the latest example of the CIA training and funding our nation's enemies, we found ourselves in 2001 after the terror attacks that fall, looking for targets. And I want to distinguish between two sets of potential targets. There were training camps in Afghanistan that may have been legitimate targets for reprisal. The United States, and not just Bush at the time, but since then, the administrations from each of the major corporate parties have effectively invaded and occupied an entire country. And the overbreadth, both in the training, the precursors to the Taliban 40 years ago, to invading an entire country, and this is a theme that Graeme was sort of seizing on here, people are reacting in the last couple of days to a set of visible images that we've all seen, forgetting that there have been 20 years of images that we haven't seen. Ongoing, pervasive lies. The Washington Post first revealed this in 2019, that every story we'd heard from Afghanistan since the invasion was unreliable. And that story has come out in even sharper relief in the last few days. But so people responding to whatever horrors they're witnessing now might be overlooking the 20 years of horrors that we have not had the opportunity to see. And everything here from the torture at Bagram Air Force Base, which makes sense to discuss in some detail, to the drone strikes and the collateral damage. To the extent the Taliban was not popular before, we certainly made them popular by supporting, enabling any number of human rights abuses with impunity. And you might think of those only as human rights violations. Many of us in the human rights community noted at the time that these are security threats because they drive people into the arms of our nation's enemies. Torture in particular, one reason we oppose it, not just that it's an abstract violation of human rights, but it's a bad idea from a security standpoint. And I dare say the result in Afghanistan over the last week proves the point.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's a really good point that you make about the kind of selective access we have to images which represent or convey what is going on the ground, and how that can lead to selective outrage. And there's this interesting tension that I've been observing where there are people who I think are having a humanitarian-based response that is being kind of dismissed as a whole, response to the images and what's happening, which is being dismissed as a whole because historically the idea that we have to be there to save the women or what have you has been weaponized by kind of the military apparatus to justify imperialism, right? So there's a really, understandable backlash to folks who articulate any concern about how the withdrawal is happening and whether or not there are consequences that could have been avoided. And sometimes I think the response to that can come off as a little callous. I understand that there's definitely a bad faith version of that, but it strikes me that not all of it is bad faith. I don't know. Am I being overly naive? Stephen, I want to give you a chance to get in here.
No, of course not. And I think on the left, we should welcome debates that are about, debates over policy that are about moving U.S. foreign policy into the realm of working class interests or progressive values. I think that's great to have those conversations. The one thing I'll say about, sort of the images, as you mentioned, Brianna, of the withdrawal is that we'll all remember the 600 to 700 Afghans piled into that C-17 cargo aircraft as sort of an 11th hour desperate evacuation. What falls out, and, usually the conversations deviate from, okay, we have to send more of those planes in and more troops to secure the area to help evacuate Afghans, or that this is just imperialistic branding. Neither one I think both are legitimate to some sense, but neither one really gets to the heart of the issue, which is before that plane took off, there was 984 C-17 loads of military equipment, not people, U.S. military equipment retrograded out of Afghanistan. And if this drawdown is anything like the Iraq drawdown, then a lot of that equipment will end up in the hands of police used against our own people. So when the human element falls out to that extent, both parties can essentially be right, but there has to be a firm grasp on this is how empires function versus, yes, due to this imperialistic blunder, there can still be good things done on the way out. And in the future, too. It's just occupation is not one of those modalities to enact humanitarian improvement.
So for example, a friend of the show, Glenn Greenwald, tweeted out, I believe yesterday, I know some are sincere that they favored withdrawal but object to, quote, how it was done. But precisely because the U.S. government lied, there was no Afghan security forces, there was no good way to leave. And that's the pretext they use for endless war. Not now, not this way, etc. Is it true, is it as black and white as that there is no good way to do this, therefore any critique of the withdrawal is in bad faith?
I would take a middle position there. I don't think there's a good way to withdraw. I don't think that means that every critique is in bad faith. And, let's be clear. I think the concerns, particularly about the risks that might face and the opportunities available to women and girls, that's a completely legitimate concern. And for people to raise it there's nothing wrong about that, to raise the concern, and especially given the history of the way the Taliban ruled the country in the 90s. And the two things that tend not to get raised in those conversations first is that women and girls bore the brunt of the violence over the last 20 years that was happening under this shroud of secrecy enforced by the Pentagon. And when Daniel Hale, the military whistleblower, notes that 90% of the deaths from drone strikes are collateral damage, what he's talking about are dead women and children. And people didn't seem to care much about them then. So it fits this whole point about the double standard. We were talking before about a double standard between concerns that we see images from and those that we don't. This is not necessarily a matter of the images, but similarly, people are concerned about a legitimate issue that they know about and ignoring one that they were misled or kept from knowing about. Another thing just to note here, and I don't know what the future holds, it is worth noting that the incoming government, or at least people who claim to represent it, have made different promises about the future of women under whatever government emerges there. And I am loath to judge the future through the lens only of the past, recognizing the opportunity for people to improve. I certainly don't have any trust in the Taliban's respect for women's rights, but the pretext that should be then the basis for a continuing example of imperial hubris. There's no way to see the American role in Afghanistan through any lens other than the extraterritorial assertion of our interests in a way that is just profoundly untenable. We're talking about projecting military force halfway across the globe to protect terrain that we don't understand from people with greater local legitimacy. We should have learned this lesson 50 years ago in Vietnam. And it's appalling, frankly, that we have to learn it again at such great, enormous cost, both to our national treasure and just in terms of the blood that's been spilled.
So one of the controversial tipping points over the last couple of days was an exchange between another friend of the show, Marianne Williamson, and decidedly not friend of the show, Bill Kristol, where he tweeted along the lines of the idea that a small number of troops, I think fewer than 600 he put out there, could have been left on the ground to enable a safer, less hectic withdrawal, one that perhaps protected the interest of, translators and others who have aided the U.S. efforts and have been kind of left high and dry. Marianne Williamson agreed with that, and I think some combination of just the optics of agreeing with Bill Kristol and some of her other tweets led it to be kind of like the dunking session of the weekend. But after I did some follow-up reading and talking to some other folks, and I encountered several other people who I wouldn't describe as imperialists, kind of making this a similar case to say, okay, we have 800 bases all over the world. We have these very small presences in a lot of places, and this wouldn't be anomalous, though certainly part of a bad global project. But there seems like there's something symbolic about the absolute nature of Biden's withdrawal that doesn't necessarily seem to be based on the wisdom of this particularized circumstance. Does that seem accurate to those of you who have a lot more experience in this area than I certainly do?
I'll be able to speak. I'm interested in hearing Graeme's perspective for sure, but I can speak just briefly on the U.S. policy perspective. After Obama surged and it didn't work, violence increased, Taliban became empowered, even though if they lost particular land areas that they were formerly occupying. The violence was really just outsourced to the Afghan security forces who, after the U.S. sort of projected their failings on and packed up and left most of the troops that were originally in the area. The withdrawal was from like 90,000 to around 10 or 15,000. Most of the violence was directed towards Afghan security forces or against civilians, either through the security forces or through U.S. bombings. So just because there's a limited footprint and ostensibly low cost, there's still violence going on, and there will still be sort of endless wars going on and projections of imperialist violence because there are U.S. troops on the ground. So if you look at Iraq and Afghanistan, or Iraq and Syria, for example, Biden has bombed both countries under the basis of, yes, sort of a vague terrorist threat, but also to protect U.S. personnel. He's literally describing it as self-defense, as 6,000 miles away from D.C. And the same thing in Somalia. That was his justification as well, to protect U.S. troops and our partners on the ground. So had the Afghan security forces not sort of surrendered so quickly, my bet was that the U.S. would continue to prop up the Afghan security forces and continue to escalate its bombing spree. So what I'm trying to get at is that the cost of the status quo is, I think, a lot higher than people realize. And another part of that is that, we're experiencing 20 years of lies, even if there was some sort of measurable humanitarian difference that was taking place. I'm not, denying that there might have been. It's still impossible to balance out on what are the human costs in addition to the financial costs. So it's just one of those things where we just don't have enough data. The burden of proof is just too high on keeping troops there that I just don't see a viable defense for it.
Graeme?
Yeah, what Stephen said about the cost of status quo really resonates with me, obviously. I've had friends that were killed and kidnapped. I've been bombed and shot at and rocketed and mortared and RPG'd. And just, you can't feel the sort of bone-shaking impact of the war without feeling like, really, this is just going to be our regular way of doing business decade after decade. We're going to continue to prosecute wars like this around the world. And that it really goes back to what Shahid said about hubris. And it is hubristic to think that America can decide security policy for the globe. And so I think what we are seeing is a kind of iconic moment where America's hegemony is diminished and we are moving towards a more multipolar world where problems that are global, like how do you deal with terrorism or how do you deal with climate change, these problems are going to have to be addressed more cooperatively amongst nations. In probably what will be endless, annoying multilateral formats. I myself, in my former role as a United Nations staffer, I've been in these meetings, where nations try to get together and hash things out, and it is incredibly ineffective and annoying. However, I think that is going to have to be the way forward without, America serving as the kind of with us or against us coalition of the willing kind of era. I think that's if it wasn't over before, it was over the moment that Afghans started dropping from planes in Kabul.
If I may add just one thing, just to sort of isolate a particular point that hasn't been raised, and I absolutely agree with both Stephen and Graeme and generally on all these points. When you were asking Brianna about the way in which the withdrawal has been executed, one part just to focus on here is the role of military contractors. In some respects, when we're talking about this untenability of being the global policeman, we're talking about the Monroe Doctrine and the way it expanded. The Rumsfeld Doctrine is the one I want to point out now. And, we recently witnessed his passing on. His signature legacy, Donald Rumsfeld, Bush's Secretary of Defense, was to outsource key military functions to contractors. The point of that, this is also what Dick Cheney was sort of infamous for. And one of the points of that was to fill their pockets of their friends. But one of the consequences is that it operationally undermined the opportunity for meaningful coordination at a time like this. Reports have emerged that one of the things that caught Afghan security forces off guard was the sudden departure of contractors. And to whatever extent the military had a phased plan or a plan of any kind at all, contractors don't. They are outside the command infrastructure and they follow their own interests. And so when we wage war by mercenary, we predispose ourselves and the people who we subject our large S to these kinds of outcomes. I do have some confidence that the military, if it were organized within the command structure that was accountable to the president, might have done a very different thing than the wholesale abandonment, particularly of logistics and intelligence capabilities that were supported by contractors. So I just want to point out not only the collapse of our grand imperial experiment and the hubris of projecting our interests everywhere, but also the very particular process of privatizing war for profit. There's a lot more I could say there, but I just want to bring that point on.
No, I'm glad you brought that up, and I want to stay there for a second and also unpack some of the specifics about what life is like on the ground currently, because there is some discussion on the left that says, this is an extremely inexpensive war, $2 trillion. And then there's this counter that says, well, recently the costs have fallen and the cost of maintaining are relatively low, commensurate with these bases all over the world, et cetera, et cetera. And there's a way that can start to kind of obscure, I think, the human cost that you're describing. And people get on cable news and there are allusions to some of the sexual violence against young boys, some of the difficulty in managing an area where there's so much economic disparity and rank corruption. Can any of you start to paint a picture of why exactly it's been such a mess in Afghanistan in particular?
It's a big question. It's one of those sort of how much time do you have questions.
It's only time limited by you gentlemen.
In some ways, it was a mess before it even started. The United States was negotiating to obtain Osama bin Laden before 9/11. Those negotiations intensified, of course, after 9/11 and didn't go the way America wanted right away. And so America invaded. And I think, there's a body of scholarship that suggests that the whole war could have been avoided if we had just, increased the price and got Osama through negotiation rather than through invasion. There is also a probably much fuller body of scholarship that suggests that having invaded, that it would have been better to include all the major political factions in the country, which would have included the Taliban and Hizb Islami, both of which were excluded from the initial political settlement at Bonn.
Was there a reason for the exclusion?
It seemed to come down to we didn't like them, really. America wasn't in a mood to compromise after 9/11. And there was a sort of a visceral, I'm sure you guys are all have your own 9/11 memories. On 9/11, I was in a Canadian newsroom and my boss told me to drive down to the fourth crash site. So I ended up pretty quickly in a field in Pennsylvania looking at a smoking piece of wreckage. And on my drive down there from Canada, I filled up at a gas station, and the gas station attendant was standing there under the clear blue sky, of course, because there were no contrails that day. And he said, "Yup, we're going to kill some ragheads." And I, as a Canadian, that's like, I said those words on the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation's radio show, and they bleeped me out. It's so offensive to Canadians. It's kind of racial slur, and it just the sense of America's visceral need for revenge was not going to be slaked by holding a trial for somebody in New York. It was clear there was going to be military action of some kind, and the venue for that was Afghanistan. So I I don't know, lots of mistakes along the way.
Yeah, I certainly remember. I mean, I moved to New York 6 months to the day before 9/11. We had been living in Kenya, where our embassy had been bombed in 1998, and famously, those families didn't get recompense until they were lumped in with the 9/11 families. But I remember, I was a 11th grader. I just started the school year, and having, I think, perhaps because of my different perspective. As someone who had lived internationally and had lost, friends and family of friends in bombings and similar kind of randomized acts of violence and terrorism in the past, I remember watching the American response as somewhat of an outsider. And the way that you did as a Canadian, even though I was very close to it physically, my brother watched the second tower fall out of our bedroom window, et cetera. And it feels like even observing that kind of visceral reaction, I did not necessarily expect the tail on this thing to be as long as it has been. And I'm curious, again, just to press on this issue of what are the particulars of what's the Princess Bride quote, never wage a land war in Central Asia. Like, what are the particulars of this particular environment? And the cultural factors, the geographic factors, the religious factors, whatever it is, that has made this particular conflict so intractable. Shahid, I don't know, you said you had some thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, one of them I would just lay out here is analogous to a problem that we observed in the United States right before this whole series of events unfolded. I'm thinking specifically about the drug trade. And so this is going to connect poppy and heroin cultivation to what we should have learned in the domestic and Western Hemisphere war on drugs. So well before we invaded Afghanistan, the CIA started running crack cocaine into the United States. And one of the things we observed is that in communities where there aren't a lot of economic opportunities, when you create a black market that is very lucrative, it attracts participants. That is exactly the recipe that unfolded in Afghanistan over the last 20 years. And it's not as if we sought ways to create economic opportunities for people there. I've spoken with figures on the ground on the Pakistani side of the border who made the point that one of the things, this is 10 years ago, one of the things that the US could have really done to support an independent, legal Afghan economy would be to liberalize textile tariffs. Textiles are one of the principal exports of that region. They are discriminated against in the US market because we deny the opportunity for them to participate in what economists would describe as their comparative advantage. We effectively force them, or at least invite them tacitly, to participate in an extraordinarily lucrative market that has destabilized the country and filled the pockets of terror networks for the last 20 years. I wrote an article in 2010 noting how the single greatest strike we could achieve against violent extremism would be to legalize the international poppy trade. But we didn't do that. Heroin production increased dramatically under the US-backed occupation after the invasion. And one of the reasons for the ongoing instability is the fact that there was this phenomenally lucrative cash cow for the Taliban and terror networks. And we effectively created it by denying legal alternatives. And so that's one facet, I would say, that's not geographic, it's more economic. When we look at the geography of Afghanistan, one of its unique facets is an incredibly mountainous, steep mountainous terrain, and it's big. So like there are lots of places to hide. So as a tactical matter for a place for an invading army to try to root out folks who might hold themselves up in caves, for instance, that is a project that literally would take generations. We're one generation into it, and it seems that we didn't make any progress at all. One thing I'd also just note here is that when the CIA trained the Mujahideen in the 80s to fight the Soviets, they actually built infrastructure that Al-Qaeda and the Taliban used against us over the last 20 years. Everything from subterranean tunnels, and I'm sure they expanded upon them since the ones that the CIA helped them build, to training, tactics. It wasn't just a matter of equipping and funding our nation's enemies. We literally built infrastructure that made it more complicated to achieve the objective that the military sought out to over the last 20 years. But I do just want to double down on the heroin piece, because I think that's an area that economics has something to say about this, and it's well established, yet somehow economists don't, or the national security folks don't allow economics into the conversation. And this is not rocket science. And again, we experienced this before in the destabilization of cities across the United States. The very same dynamic played out in Afghanistan over the last generation.
Well, Shahid,
can I just add a couple of quick points of clarification? Sure. So it wasn't so much about caves. There was a NATO study that concluded the vast majority of Taliban fighters were fighting within 1 kilometer of their own homes. So most of this war for the last 20 years was conducted within walking distance of villages. On the other hand, on the economics, I have a piece in the New York Times today on the economic fallout from this. Me and my study co-author used satellites to look at trade flows and match that with hundreds of interviews on the ground. We concluded that the informal economy is massive, in some places twice as big as the formal economy. So a lot of the sort of capital-focused, and I use that term geographically and not economically, the view from the capital, from Kabul, really didn't see into the provinces in the way that the economy was actually working. And one of the things that it failed to see was that, yes, opium is a big source of revenue. I'm not denying that. However, a much bigger source of revenue is the illegal movement of legal goods, so diesel and dishwashers and Toyota Corollas. That was by far the biggest source of revenue, both for the Taliban and for state or state-affiliated actors. And I just have to say, like, people talk about, the Taliban getting rich off drugs. It's just, come on. The study after study, it was pro-government actors that collected maybe twice as much money as the Taliban did from the drug trade. So when the Taliban in recent weeks swept away all these police checkpoints, they weren't just sweeping away state apparatus. They were also sweeping away drug cartels. The part of the reason why people were so angry with the Western presence is that it propped up extremely corrupt, extremely violent narco-mafias.
But Graeme, would legalizing the poppy trade, to Shahid's point, have helped regardless of whether it was the Afghan government or the Taliban who were, fueling the black market economy, as it were?
This is another how much time do you have question. You can't just legalize poppy in one lawless state like Afghanistan and solve the problem. If you had a sort of global, decriminalization regime or something, if people are still buying opium, there will still be an illegal opium trade. And so in a place like Afghanistan, if you legalize, all you do is you create legal fields that will then increase the supply. Because, most of my friends who have fields, say, in the Panjwai Valley, southwestern Kandahar city, they'll grow some opium and they'll grow some wheat. And the wheat is a hedge in case someone comes along and burns down your opium field. And so if you legalize in Afghanistan or in any other insecure context, you just dramatically increase the supply. You create another parallel legal industry that sits alongside the illegal industry.
Well, what would have to be done to shift the illegal economy into a legal economy in a way that I presume you both are saying would be ultimately more beneficial to a quote unquote nation building project or greater stability or whatever it is?
A lot of that right now is going to come down to some very important decisions that get made around whether or not the Western world decides to isolate a Taliban-run Afghanistan or not. The currency could collapse if there isn't a resumption of dollar infusions to stabilize the Afghani. The trading partners are really unsure what to do right now. Iran has still announced that it won't trade through Taliban-controlled border crossings, but there's trade sneaking through this week, as I understand it, cross-decked on trucks. There are some very big decisions that have to be made around, say, for example, the $9 billion that Afghanistan has to its name as a state. Are those assets going to stay frozen? Are they going to be unfrozen and given to the Taliban at some point? there's a huge amount of money on the table, and if Afghanistan is allowed to join the community of nations and trade normally with its partners, then its partners are going to be able to slowly try to insist on Afghanistan having a legal economy. If the Taliban are isolated as they were in the 1990s, then you plunge Afghanistan even further into the black market, and there'll be a real reliance on illicit forms of trade rather than an effort to foster any sort of a legal economy in the country.
I hugely agree with Graeme there, and I just want to paraphrase that in the active voice. A lot of this turns on Washington. We're describing whether or not Afghanistan is isolated. The question there is, does Washington impose the kind of sanctions and embargoes on that country that we have on other countries like Iran to Cuba, or do we practice the liberal international trade regime that we were so proud to champion in the 90s when we were creating the future threats there? There's a question here about our own fidelity to our own rhetoric. And just to expand the context, I mentioned this before, but just that there's a common thread here. Will we respect our own rhetoric about trade, and will we respect our own rhetoric about human rights? We've seen continuing executive impunity for the human rights violations in Afghanistan, and the economic context that we're describing is one locus of instability. I really do strongly believe that the stain of torture that the U.S. committed, DOD and CIA, particularly at Bagram Air Force Base, this is just an hour outside of Kabul, where multiple detainees were beaten to death, including people who interrogators later admitted they didn't have any suspicion of, a random 22-year-old taxi driver ending up being bludgeoned to death. And when senior officials escape any accountability for these kinds of violations, I think that also delegitimated not just the Afghan state backed by the US, but it predisposed people from the cities to the rural areas to look for alternatives. And if we practiced what we preached from trade to human rights, we might have a very different outcome to reflect on.
Well, what should the left then be pushing for out of the Biden administration going forward? Because it does seem like some on the left have declared, jokingly, but declared themselves Biden bros and fully supportive of this as the best thing that he's ever done. But should we be keeping our eye on the ball with respect to how the country is treated? I know that there was a Biden press agent who was asked about, what leverage do you have over Afghanistan at this point? And sanctions, were evoked. What kind of approach should the left be pushing, and what should we be scrutinizing coming out of the administration going forward over the next few weeks and months?
But one line of discourse that we should pay attention to is that Biden basically handed off all the blame to Afghan security forces and local government and kind of washed his hands of U.S. responsibility. And I think that's bad politics. But that aside, I think we should be pursuing some sort of accountability to the people who develop these ideas, pushing for formal and informal mechanisms of accountability to get the think tankers, the current and ex-generals, the civilian leaders who dragged us into this mess and kept us there. And I think just displacing blame entirely on the Afghans while some's there, I think it works against the overall mission to accountability. Secondly, humanitarianism. Again, humanitarianism is best enacted through humanitarian means, not military ones. And on a grander scale, I think it should be an indictment of U.S. empire, in general. In Afghanistan, it showed that the U.S. occupied for so long to deny terrorists safe havens, quote unquote safe havens, that the theory that if the U.S. isn't there, the terrorists will come in unoccupied or ungoverned zones and use it as a staging ground for international attacks. Studies have shown that it's the opposite that's true. It's that foreign powers who intervene actually create terrorism, not just locally, but against their own homeland and internationally. So Afghanistan should be used to put the whole global project of empire on trial.
Well, so this is the real overarching question that I think is really motivating both sides of this discussion and is really not being discussed explicitly. And that is imperialism bad. We're all on the same page. But there are some who would say, does that mean that we're taking a fully isolationist stance? And it feels like it has to be one or the other because there doesn't seem to be any real third-party, neutral, multinational organization that really is empowered to step in when there are human rights abuses that we might agree as a community require some kind of intervention outside of a military that is going to have these imperialist interests.
There are
UN,
international... Oh, sorry,
yeah, go ahead, please. I mean, the UN being the obvious go-to, but the problem there being that the superpower, America has made sure that it is disempowered in any real meaningful way, and it's just, an arm of our government. Partly because, God forbid, America be actually subject to sanction by that body or any independent body. So go ahead, Shahid.
Well, you took the words right out of my mouth. I was just going to say there are international legal institutions that have the legitimacy, that have the personnel, that have the capacity to be impartial actors on the ground to help facilitate the delivery of humanitarian services. But we, the United States, don't support them. And in fact, we do everything conceivable to cut them off at the knees. One of the things that happened, Graeme was talking about the ways that we ultimately went after OBL rather than through invasion. Negotiation was a process. At one point, the CIA was representing themselves as aid workers to people, and in order to gain intelligence about his ultimate whereabouts. And what that ultimately did was put every humanitarian aid worker in the line of fire by forcing them to then be suspected of being CIA agents by everybody who they might interface with. In other words, we have done everything possible as a global superpower to undermine the opportunity for international legal organizations to do their work. We have done everything possible to subject the Afghans to greater security risks. There's a point that Stephen raised that I think is just so important to realize. We, by being there, painted a target on everyone who was around us. That's kind of what, when we occupy other countries, that's the inevitable result. A very similar thing happened in Iraq when people were, before, I think it was Graeme, talking about the way in which power sharing was not so much the approach after the initial invasion. De-Baathification in Iraq had the exact same result. We shoved the generation of people who had power before out of the way. And what did that ensure that they did? It ensured that they would join an insurgency that would continue for years. And these are not just patterns and not just even predictable patterns. They are established patterns that we ignore and then repeat, and they recur. And to go back to your earlier question, I think what the left should be calling for at the moment is skepticism towards any attempt at projecting extraterritorial influence. I think what the left should be pushing for is independent journalism that does not settle for stenography repeating whatever Pentagon and CIA officials speak. And I particularly want to see an end to the discredited architects of these failed wars of imperial hubris continuing to appear on cable news programs where they continue to steer the public conversation and continue their work misleading the American public.
So what then does it look like to break that cycle? Because here's the question that, as I was mooting this over the weekend, was put to me. Bill Clinton says not intervening in Rwanda in the genocide was one of the biggest mistakes of his presidency. There seem to be these historical moments where even the left would agree, or many folks on the left would agree, the level of atrocity is so significant that even if there were bad faith actors who got something additional out of it or was part of an imperial project, we should have intervened. People will bring up World War II. Well, what would you have done instead? And in the absence of a meaningful international organization like the UN that is empowered to play the role of the world's cops, or whatever you want to call it, or humanitarian safeguards, perhaps is a more sanguine way to put it. What do you think the standard is? Is it possible to articulate a standard? I don't mean to get too metaphysical here, but it seems to me that one of the core issues here is that no one is really willing to articulate a standard for what would justify something along the lines of intervention, if anything. And if we aren't willing to articulate a standard, it gets you into these two camps of kind of a tacit isolationism or kind of war, being labeled as an imperialist. And I think that part of the tension that's come about is that folks are unwilling to be pinned with either label, and yet that those seem to be the only options in the discourse.
Can I just underline what Shahid said about the United Nations existing? I mean, I
certainly. I know my mother worked for this UN for 17 years.
Kabul. I got it. Yeah,
spent a lot of time
totally.
in Afghanistan.
But no, listen. I mean, I have friends who decided to, as they put it, stay and deliver in Kabul in the recent days as the Taliban, grabbed the checkpoints right outside of the blue United Nations gates, and they didn't know whether they were going to live or die. And they hoped that the United Nations reputation as a neutral and impartial way of delivering humanitarian aid would protect them. And as of right now, in this hour, it is protecting them. And the Taliban are respecting those blue UN gates. But let's see what happens in the days and months ahead. And that thing is only an idea. And it's only an idea if people believe in it. Like if in conversations like this, people think that there is such a thing as the United Nations that matters and can do stuff. And it only matters if people fund it. If, for example, the United States pays its United Nations dues and, and for example, you asked who can be the policeman for the world. Well, historically, in any jurisdiction, before you have police that enforce what the courts decide, you first have courts. So there is such a thing as the International Criminal Court. My country is a big fan of it. Your country, not so much. If you want someone to lay down the law, first you have to decide what the law is. And so I think if there could be more support, for example, for the ICC, then you could start to build support for enforcing some kind of rule of law on a extraterritorial way.
Well, that is of itself an interesting philosophical question, because some would argue that the power of a court is pretty meaningless unless you first have the enforcement mechanism. And it's a little bit of a chicken and the egg conversation, right? We recently had a panel of constitutional lawyers in the show discussing other matters. And one of the core debates that emerged from that conversation was, what power does the Supreme Court really have? Where does that authority come from? And what happens if if we kind of chuck the idea that it has quite the presidential effect that we think. I mean, I'm oversimplifying the conversation, but, it does feel to me, it's not entirely clear to me that kind of an abstract respect for international tribunals is going to be particularly meaningful without the investment of world superpowers, namely the United States. And it's not clear to me that the United States would ever delegate that authority outside of itself unless it was forced to, because it was no longer the world's greatest superpower. Am I being overly cynical?
I think you're actually basically answering the question that you posed before about what should the left do. One of the things the left should do is fight for international legitimacy, to fight for the U.S. to recognize the legitimacy of international, not just legal organizations, but adjudicatory organizations like the International Criminal Court, and subject our extraterritorial weight under those organizations. In other words, I think you're absolutely right that the current cast of political actors in Washington would never submit to the jurisdiction of international legal organizations. We saw this demonstrated a month ago. Ilhan Omar from Minnesota had the audacity to declare in public that all victims of state violence should deserve justice. And she called for the U.S. to respect the jurisdiction of the ICC, and the entire Democratic leadership united to condemn her for it and say it was offensive. I think that is a perfect example of where the left should be fighting, because when the Democratic Party, not just the Republicans, are declaring themselves to be unabashedly in favor of imperialism, we have a problem, and that the left has to be anti-imperial. And that includes, to go back to your sort of the metaphysical point, maybe I think is how you put it, when we look at domestic jurisprudence and where does the power in the court, and here, Cooper versus Aaron comes to mind. There's this whole litany of cases after Brown versus Board where the Supreme Court has to repeatedly say, no, we meant it, desegregate. And, right. It took a long time for anybody to effectuate that. In the international context, when we talk about what is the thing that impedes the ICC's rulings from hitting the ground, it's us. It's the U.S. It's our own rogue, independent foreign policy And nowhere demonstrates this better than our own proxy powers. And how many times has the UN passed resolutions to declare concerns about any number of human rights violations? I'm thinking particularly in Israel, where the US then becomes the sole power to stand up against human rights in the service of our own supposed interests. Right. And if what the left should be fighting for is for US interests to be subsumed to international human rights, for us to finally acknowledge international human rights as a guiding lodestar, if that were the case and we weren't deciding foreign policy based on corporate resource objectives, I do think that our perceived legitimacy around the rest of the world would change very dramatically, probably quite quickly.
Yeah, I mean, my mother loves to point out, or I shouldn't say loves, but she often points out that, America is the only country that hasn't ratified the Convention on Children's Rights. And I believe Eleanor Roosevelt was objected to objected to civil rights leaders raising the issue of treatment of Black Americans in the UN because it was just such a national embarrassment. I mean, there are multiple examples of the U.S. having one foot in and one foot out, kind of selectively wanting to herald itself as a beacon of democracy and justice while undermining the very institution that it's best placed to affect those goals. And I didn't mean for this to turn into a conversation about kind of the value of the UN or how to empower it, but it does seem to me that sometimes when you have kind of a circular firing squad on the left, it is exactly because we're having the wrong conversation. And we are not, I find a similar conversation erupts when we have any kind of conversation about what a left immigration policy looks like. And I hope to get to that in a future episode sometime soon. But, I am really interested now in this question of why it is that there isn't more of an emphasis on empowering these organizations as an alternative to our national imperialist project. And instead, there does seem to be, to your point, Graeme, a kind of indifference, a kind of poo-pooing, eye roll attitude about the United Nations and international orgs when they arise on the left. And it seems to be like a kind of a one-upmanship about who can be most snarky about how ineffectual the thing is, instead of having a conversation about how to change that.
Exactly right.
Yeah. Well, going forward, to get back to kind of the issue at hand, what do you expect to see fallout-wise over the next couple of weeks? And how can listeners who want to be supportive either through kind of like political messaging or kind of direct action do so from so many miles away?
You can reach out, and friends of mine are reaching out to your congresspeople and whoever else will listen and say, we Americans do feel a sense of responsibility for the mess that we are leaving behind in Afghanistan. And I wouldn't mind if my neighbor was an Afghan refugee. I hear that America spent billions of dollars educating a whole new generation of Afghan professionals, some of whom probably don't want to live underneath the Taliban. And, maybe he could be next door. Maybe I would hire him in my business or her in my business. And, so it's this requires an Angela Merkel style gesture. She opened the doors to a million Syrians. I'll bet America can top that.
And Stephen, your organization, can you tell us a little bit more about what the project is? And I want to put the same question to you.
Sure. My project, SPRI, Security Policy Reform Institute, is a grassroots-funded think tank that's designed to align U.S. foreign policy with working class interests. And think tanks are basically groups of nerds who get together and theoretically are independent of business interests or government interests. But that's not how it's shaked out so far, especially in the foreign policy realm, where you see a lot of think tanks whose experts are routinely on TV, who take millions of dollars from military contractors. Half of the Pentagon budget goes to contractors. So basically what's happening is Congress is appropriating funds, half of which go to the private sector, and it's fueling think tanks, it's fueling lobbying, it's fueling campaign contributions. So our project is basically, one, to just come up with really good ideas policy-wise that are in depth on how to effectively wind down empire without screwing over the people who are around us in these foreign environments. So our latest one of that brand is how to withdraw from Syria in a responsible way without harming ordinary Syrians. And the next part is, I do this through my newsletter, Speaking Security, as well, but just kind of democratizing foreign policy in a way where I'm not writing, that we're not doing, 1,000-word pieces, but short graphs that follow the money, that have 1 or 2 paragraphs of analysis, that are designed to show, like, hey, foreign policy and domestic policy are intertwined, in part because of militarism and blowback and that sort of thing, but also because every dollar sort of launched abroad is one that isn't spent here. And more than that, it's just that military spending and empire, they play by a different set of funding rules. They play by modern monetary theory, while, regular domestic funding is, sort of classical economics. Every war since Vietnam has not been paid for by a corresponding tax increase. It's just been put on credit. So one of the things that we're trying to do is sort of blend the language of, pay for us and call out hypocrisy and say, no, listen, we can pay for it. We can do all sorts of this stuff.
I think that's really an interesting point, in part because you have seen a lot of the rhetoric being, we spent $2 trillion on this. This is how much it would have cost to make public colleges free, and comparing those numbers. And then there's another camp that says, also, we spent $2 trillion. And if you really cared about the humanitarian stuff, oh my goodness, the girls, that, that kind of skeptical perspective on people who are raising those concerns. Well, then here are all the girls that could have been helped with money in these other kinds of places. And then the pushback to that is, well, our fingerprints are on the harms that are happening in this particular place. And it seems to me there's it's kind of like a trolley problem. There's differing degrees to which people are willing to say, okay, well, I might have caused this, but I can do more with the money in other places, versus folks who feel like there is like an ethical tether to making sure that you basically clean up your mess behind you. And I wonder, I think that's I think there's validity to that kind of emotional response, even if I don't think it's necessarily logical. And I wonder, Stephen, like how, if at all, you've been negotiating that as you are kind of really explicitly making those comparisons about how to spend the money and where, nationally versus internationally, domestically versus internationally.
I'm interested in, not just foreign policy, but the left in general building power. So my approach towards foreign policy making and sort of mobilization is the same that I believe it should be in domestic policy, which is big tent, big sort of working class oriented projects. So part of it is, the left doesn't have control of the foreign policy discourse. In order for that to happen, there has to be mobilization. There has to be more engagement. And the way to get people engaged can vary from person to person. But when I see sort of someone tweet out something, well, with this $2 trillion we spent in Afghanistan, we could have spent, X number amount of hospitals. We could have basically provided housing for all for, a couple of years. I think that's fine. I think that doesn't necessarily mean that that person doesn't care about international responsibilities. It just shows that we're not spending money in the right places. So regardless, the way I balance it is, will this investment improve working class life? Will it make life less shitty for the working class? And that's sort of the basis on which I operate. So as a way to sort of square, like, okay, domestic and international interests and harm reduction, one of the best things that lefts can do is push to nationalize the defense industry. In the interest of converting the labor and expertise that exists in those sectors, and there's an immense amount of talent in that sector, and put it to use in the green economy. And then follow that up with, okay, we're clearly sending a signal to the world that we're interested in demilitarizing our foreign policy. Our main security threat going forward isn't a rival between democracies and autocracies. It's the obvious thing, which is that our planet's melting, and we're choosing to lead on this. So that sort of accomplishes this far foreign policy objective, while at the same time, we're rallying around providing jobs, working class jobs, because, science, technology, green tech, it produces about twice as many jobs as an equal investment in military spending. So the trick is to sort of align it with values that are not immediately in reach, but also say, hey, we're not wasting your time with this shit. Like, we are absolutely invested in your immediate interests as well as sort of meeting your values as well.
You said something, I forget the words you used, but you alluded to one's international obligations. Or Shahid, I'm going to ask you, is there a such thing like today with not having the UN that we wish the UN the world deserves? What is our obligation? What is America as a country's obligation on the world stage?
The very first obligation we have is to get our knee off the neck of the world. And I choose that metaphor quite intentionally. And one of the points that I'm really trying to seize at is that when you describe the totally understandable emotional inclination for people to want to clean up our mess, what I think too many people don't understand is that our efforts to clean our mess make everything worse. And they have for decades. This isn't new. Every time we have tried to make something better in the foreign policy dimension, what we have ultimately done is worsen the conditions on the ground.
Is that an inevitability? Is it true that there was no good withdrawal? Like there's nothing in the realm of imagination that could have made it better? Or is it just that the people who are acting in this instance don't have the incentives to do it the right way?
I think it's more the latter. And this is where I got into the point about contracting. If we, the role of private profit, this is why Eisenhower warned us 60 years ago that the military-industrial complex would destroy democracy in America and undermine our rights and liberties if we weren't knowledgeable and alert. And in our failures to be knowledgeable and alert, we have allowed private profit-making enterprises, not just defense contractors. I mean, defense contractors are the obvious ones, but I would just as similarly put in the bucket any number of resource extraction industries that benefit from offensive wars, fossil fuel. When Stephen, absolutely yes to nationalizing the defense industry, I similarly think we need to nationalize the fossil fuel industry because they're ultimately one of the upstream demanders of these kinds of foreign policies and this paradigm that presumes that we have the right to play this role when we don't even respect human rights in the United States. I mean, this is one of the other things that I think I wish more Americans understood. We are one of the world's principal violators of international human rights. Solitary confinement, for instance, is widely recognized as an example of internationally prohibited torture. We practice it widely across the United States. We have political prisoners in the United States. We have more prisoners than any country in the world.
Prosecuting children as adults is one of the reasons I think we don't sign on to the Rights of Convention for the Child.
That's exactly right. And what does it say when our leaders refuse to join international agreements in order to protect widely entrenched industries that are dedicated to predation? And ultimately here, the point is that we, the United States, need to get out of the way. And I don't think of that as an isolationist stance, because we can certainly have humanitarian programs. We can certainly have a footprint in the rest of the world. I would rather see that being led by USAID than the CIA. That's the ultimate point here, is we should be leading with our largesse, not with our weapons.
Well, I think that's a great place to stop. Where can people find you and your work?
Folks can follow us at shahidforchange.us or on any of the social media platforms at Shahid for Change.
All right. Thank you. And Stephen?
You can follow my think tank Spry on Twitter at security_reform, or me on Twitter independently at Stephen, Stephen, Semler, Semler.
Thank you so much for that. I think Graeme stepped away for an important call. He's been dealing with a lot of stuff that's still unraveling on the ground. We appreciate all three of you being with us today. And thank you for indulging this kind of philosophical conversation about some of these broad issues on the left.
Thanks for having us, Bree.
Thank you. My pleasure.
Hey, YouTube, don't forget this is a podcast. To get full episodes, including ones that are behind a paywall, go to patreon.com/badfaithpodcast. To get more episodes, please do subscribe to this channel, hit the notification bell, and like this video.